On the 25th of February 1601, on Tower Green, inside the Tower of London, a former favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, the last Tudor Queen, was led upwards towards the execution scaffold for his death. Waiting for him was an axeman who was ready to take his head from his shoulders. Robert Devereux was the second Earl of Essex, and he was sentenced to death for treason, and he was someone who was linked to rebellion. He was a man who was jealous, but he captured the imagination of the Queen, and some believed he may have even been a man linked to marriage with the Queen, Elizabeth I. But following his execution, Robert Devereux was interred and buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the Tower of London's walls. However, this was not the end of his story. Centuries later, his body was dug up and was exhumed from its grave, and what those people who did this found was remarkable. Robert Devereux was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth I, and at the age of 9 he succeeded to his father's title and became the second Earl of Essex. As a young man, he was seen as a skilled soldier, and he fought in the Spanish Netherlands, and when he returned to England, he was made the Master of the Horse by Elizabeth I, but he at times could anger the Queen. But he always managed to gain her favour again if he had ever annoyed her. Some at the time thought that he would be a possible husband to Elizabeth I, as they would stay up late playing cards, but he also married Frances Wallingham in secret. This was not ideal, as the Queen would not be happy when she found out about this. He stayed inside of England after a number of foreign adventures, and he then even helped to foil an alleged plot against the Queen's life by a physician inside of her court, Rodrigo Lopez. He tried to challenge the authority of the Cecil family and defied the Queen's authority when he pursued a Spanish treasure fleet, and also when the Third Spanish Armada appeared off the English coast in October 1597. The coast was undefended, and there was a significant amount of chaos and panic. But Devereux fell further from favour in the eyes of Queen Elizabeth when he took the job as the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He was sent to deal with the rebellious Irish chieftains, and he led a huge force to Ireland, 16,000 soldiers, to end the rebellion. He said he would confront them head-on. However, he fought a series of pointless battles and wasted money, and he also entered a truce with one of the rebels, which was seen as a humiliation for the English. And the Queen was furious with this. When he returned, the Queen had banned him ever coming back to court, and he then burst into her bedchamber in the morning at Nonsuch Palace, whilst the Queen was getting dressed, which then caused chaos. He was then ordered to stand in front of an interrogation regarding his dereliction of duty in Ireland, and he was held under house arrest at this time whilst the investigations occurred into what had actually happened in Ireland. Essex was tried in front of 18 men, and he was convicted and was deprived of his public office. However, he then, after achieving freedom, was involved in rebellion, and this was known as Essex's rebellion after him. He began to fortify Essex House and rally supporters, and he turned in his opinion of the Queen. He, on the 8th of February 1601, marched out of Essex House, and he entered the city of London to try and gain an audience with the Queen, but he was proclaimed a traitor by Cecil, and his men tried to get through a barrier, and this was a skirmish. But Devereux then surrendered after he was besieged inside of Essex House. He was then, in the February of 1601, tried in front of peers for treason. It was stated of this that the indictment charged Essex with conspiring and imagining at London to depose and slay the Queen, and to subvert the government. It also stated that Essex had endeavoured to raise himself to the crown of England and usurp the royal dignity, and that in order to fulfil these intentions, he and others rose and assembled themselves in open rebellion, and moved and persuaded many of the citizens of London to join them in their treason, and endeavoured to get the city of London into their possession and power, and wounded and killed many of the Queen's subjects then and there assembled for the purpose of quelling such rebellion. Essex was charged also with holding the Lord Keeper and the other privy councillors in custody for 4 hours and more. He also claimed that the Infanta of Spain had a right to the crown of England, which was a terrible thing, and he was then found guilty of treason, and on the 25th of February 1601 his execution was carried out. He was allowed an execution inside the Tower of London, as he was of such noble standing. He was to be executed by beheading, and he did not get the standard sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering, and he was brought by 16 guards from his rooms inside the Tower of London to the execution scaffold. His execution was not very clean. The executioner that day was Thomas Derrick, who listened to Devereux's speech on the scaffold, and he admitted his treason, and he said he never wanted to hurt the Queen. He bade farewell and hoped the Queen would get a long reign, but when Devereux placed his head on the block, the executioner stood there with his sharp axe, and he then struck the weapon on Devereux's head, but it did not come off with one blow. And then it took a second swing to do this, but still his head did not come off. Finally, a third swing of the axe took Devereux's head clean away. Following his execution, his remains were then collected, and Devereux was taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula next to the Tower Green. His body was lowered into a grave, which was then covered over, and he was buried close to where 2 of Henry VIII's wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were interred. But over the next few centuries, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower fell into a terrible state of disrepair and decay. During the reign of Queen Victoria, the Queen visited the tower and ordered renovations of the chapel to make sure the resting place of the Tudor Queens was well respected and was in good condition. Because of this, the floor, which had lifted and was uneven, was lifted, and the chapel and a committee of people were brought in to identify the bodies of those men and women who were found. The bodies of some of the most prominent executed Tudor figures were found, and this included the remains of Queen Anne Boleyn. But amongst the bodies found were the remains of Robert Devereux. The committee that gathered inspected the remains, and they confirmed that they belonged to a man in his 30s who lost his life by decapitation and beheading by a sword or an axe. With this, they came to the conclusion that this body belonged to the executed former favourite of Elizabeth I. His remains were then placed inside of a new lead casket, and a plate was placed on this to show who the bones belonged to, and these were then placed inside of the Queen's house opposite the chapel before they were then reburied close to the altar along with some of the most prominent executed Tudor people. Devereux was interred in the second row below the altar, and was interred second in on the right between the murdered poet Sir Thomas Overbury and the executed Earl of Arundel. He was buried behind Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who lost her life alongside Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's 5th wife. Robert Devereux was a former favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, and he was someone who also caused the Queen a significant amount of stress and turmoil. He made a number of significant issues inside of Ireland, and later, because of him being ostracised, he tried to rebel to catch the Queen's attention. But for this he was sent to the executioner's scaffold inside the Tower of London. He was then buried in the chapel there, and his remains were then dug up centuries later. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.